Frederick Thomas had learned to recognize hunger. Not the kind that rumbled in an empty stomach, but the sharper, more dangerous variety that glittered in a woman's eyes when she calculated his worth. 10 years as the Duke of Hollybank had taught him to spot it across a crowded ballroom, in the deliberate stumble that brought a lady into his path, in the practiced gasp of surprise, in the way a fan might slip from nervous fingers at precisely the right moment. He had become an expert at reading desire dressed as coincidence. Which is why the woman standing by the terrace doors, spine straight as a blade, gaze fixed determinedly on the rain-dark garden beyond, struck him as a puzzle worth solving. She was the only person in the entire glittering assembly who had not once glanced in his direction. Not when he'd entered. Not when Lady Hartwell had announced his presence with her usual theatrical gasp. Not even when he'd crossed the room, close enough that his shadow fell across her simple dove-grey gown. She looked at him the way one might regard an unexpected obstruction, with mild annoyance and a clear intention to step around it. Frederick Thomas, who had spent a decade being pursued, found himself utterly arrested by a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. The spring of 1815, London. The chandeliers blazed like captive suns above the Hartwell ballroom, but Frederick felt only the weight of their heat and the suffocating press of expectations. Another season, another parade of eligible young women in pastels and pearls, another performance of the same tired social ballet he'd been dancing since he inherited his title at 22. "Your Grace," Lord Edmund appeared at his elbow with a glass of brandy. "You have that look again. The one that makes mothers hide their daughters. I was unaware my face required their approval." "It doesn't. Your fortune does." Edmund followed Frederick's gaze across the room. "Though I notice you're staring at the one woman here who appears to be actively avoiding the marriage market entirely. That's Miss Louise George. Quite the scandal, really. She manages an estate north of here, refuses to hunt for a husband, and has the appalling habit of discussing crop rotation at dinner parties. Lady Hartwell only invited her out of obligation to her late father." Frederick watched as Miss George extracted herself from a conversation with practiced efficiency, her movements economical, her expression pleasant but firmly closed. She wore no jewelry save a simple gold locket. Her chestnut hair was arranged without artifice. And when she finally, inevitably, met his gaze across the room, there was no flutter, no blush, no calculation. There was only a cool, assessing look that lasted precisely 2 seconds before she dismissed him and turned back to the window. Something in Frederick's chest, some part of him that had been dormant for years, flickered to life. "Introduce me," he said. Edmund nearly choked on his drink. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me." "Frederick, I don't think you understand." "She's not, she won't." Edmund stumbled over his words in a way that would have been amusing if Frederick had been in a mood to be amused. "She's turned down 3 perfectly respectable offers this season alone. She's made it abundantly clear she has no interest in being collected like a prize at a country fair." Frederick set down his own glass with deliberate precision. "Good. Neither do I. He crossed the ballroom with the same certainty he'd once used to cross battlefields, before he'd inherited the dukedom, before his life had become an endless succession of empty social maneuvers. He was aware of the attention following him, of the whispers starting like wind through winter grass, but he kept his focus fixed on the woman who still hadn't turned around. "Miss George," he said when he reached her. She turned slowly, and Frederick found himself looking into hazel eyes that held neither warmth nor hostility, only a frank, unsettling directness. "Your Grace." Her curtsy was correct but brief, as if she were checking an item off a list. "I heard about your father's passing last autumn. You have my condolences." "Thank you. Though I confess I'm surprised you knew him." "I didn't. But courtesy costs nothing." She glanced past him at the ballroom, clearly calculating her escape route. "If you'll excuse me. Dance with me." The words came out more like a command than an invitation, and Frederick watched something sharpen in her expression, a wariness that made him feel suddenly, uncomfortably aware of how used he'd grown to getting his way. "I don't dance, Your Grace." "You don't dance, or you don't dance with dukes." "I don't dance with gentlemen who phrase requests as orders." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were not. "Now, if you'll truly excuse me, I have an early departure tomorrow." She moved a step around him, and Frederick, who had spent years being pursued, being flattered, being offered everything from fortunes to family alliances, found himself doing something he hadn't done in over a decade. He stepped aside. And as Miss Louise George walked away from him without a backward glance, Frederick Thomas realized two things simultaneously. First, that he had just been dismissed by a woman in a dove-grey gown who looked at him as if he were simply another man in an overcrowded room, and second, that he was going to have to work significantly harder than he'd anticipated to earn even 5 minutes of her genuine attention. The realization should have frustrated him. Instead, for the first time in years, Frederick found himself genuinely intrigued. Frederick had perfected the art of enduring ballrooms. He knew precisely when to smile, when to incline his head, when to deploy the particular expression that encouraged conversation without inviting intimacy. The Hartwell assembly was no different from a dozen others, too warm, too bright, too filled with the same ambitious faces wearing different gowns. "You look like a man attending his own execution," Lord Edmund murmured, appearing at his elbow with characteristic timing. "Accurate, if uncharitable." "Then allow me to provide entertainment." Edmund gestured subtly toward the terrace doors. "That woman there, Miss Louise George. Not beautiful by London standards, mind you, but look at her posture. Utterly uninviting. She's been here an hour and hasn't sought introduction to a single eligible gentleman." Frederick followed his gaze and found himself studying a figure in dove-grey who stood as if she were alone in the room. Her spine was straight as judgment itself, her gaze fixed on the rain beyond the windows with an intensity that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "Extraordinary," Frederick said quietly. "What is?" "To see someone who wants to be here even less than I do." Frederick crossed the ballroom with purpose, aware of the ripple of attention following him but keeping his focus on the woman by the terrace. She didn't turn as he approached, though he was certain she'd noticed. "Miss George," he said, "I understand you manage an estate north of London." She turned slowly, her expression polite but utterly neutral. I do. The soil there must be challenging this time of year. I found that. Your Grace. Her interruption was gentle but final. I'm quite capable of managing my own land without aristocratic commentary. But I thank you for your concern. She offered a brief curtsy. If you'll excuse me, I have correspondence to finish before morning. It's barely 9 o'clock. Precisely why I should leave now. Something flickered in her eyes, not hostility, but a firm boundary being drawn. Good evening. She moved past him with practiced efficiency, leaving Frederick standing alone in a room full of people who would have given anything for 5 minutes of his attention. He'd just been dismissed. Twice. By a woman in a grey gown who looked at him as if he were merely ordinary. Frederick discovered he couldn't stop watching her leave. The townhouse on Wimpole Street was modest by any measure, its brick facade clean but unremarkable. Frederick's carriage looked absurdly out of place parked before it, like a peacock in a henhouse. The housekeeper who answered wore an expression of pure bewilderment. Miss George is in her study, Your Grace. I'll see if she's receiving. Tell her I've come to discuss crop rotation. Louise appeared in the doorway moments later, still wearing her morning dress, ink staining her right thumb. Your Grace. This is unexpected. You mentioned managing your estate. I thought we might compare notes on tenant agreements and drainage systems. She studied him with those unsettling hazel eyes, clearly trying to determine his angle. You've come to my home to discuss drainage and soil amendment. Perhaps fencing disputes. You're out of place here. It wasn't cruel, merely factual. She gestured to her cramped study, its desk buried under ledgers and correspondence. This isn't a drawing room for social calls. I'm aware. Then why are you really here? Frederick found himself without a prepared answer. Because you left. Her expression shifted, confusion replacing suspicion for just a moment before her guard rose again. The charity auction at Pemberton House hummed with polite competition until Lot 17 was announced, a parcel of land adjacent to the George estate. Frederick watched Louise straighten in her seat, watched her gloved hands tighten on her reticule. £2,000, she said clearly. Frederick knew that voice. It held everything she owned. 2,500, called Lord Ashworth from across the room. Louise's jaw tensed. 3,000. Frederick saw it then, the edge of desperation she was trying to hide. She needed this land. And she was about to lose it. 3,500, Frederick said. The room fell silent. Louise turned to stare at him, her face draining of color. Sold to His Grace, the Duke of Hollybank, the auctioneer announced. Louise was on her feet before the gavel fell. She crossed the room with fury barely contained beneath breeding, stopping close enough that only he could hear her voice shake. How dare you? Each word was precise, lethal. You think this is a game? My family's survival is not your entertainment. Miss George, I only meant to. Stay away from my life. She turned and walked out, leaving him holding a deed he'd never wanted. If this story has captured your interest, please like the video and subscribe for more. The package arrived 3 days later, wrapped in plain paper with no ducal seal. Louise opened it at her desk, still angry, still certain of his cruelty. The deed fell out first. Then the letter. Miss George, I have made a career of solving problems with authority and money. It is, I realize now, the habit of a man who has forgotten how to ask rather than command. You were about to lose land vital to your estate. I thought only of preventing that loss. I did not consider that my interference would feel like theft of your agency rather than protection of your future. The deed is yours without condition or obligation. I purchased it. You needed it. That is the sum of the transaction. I am sorry for treating your independence as something requiring my rescue. You were right, I do not understand what it means to fight for survival rather than simply exist in plenty. With respect for your strength, which I should have shown from the beginning. Louise read it twice, then a third time. The certainty that had sustained her anger for 3 days cracked painfully down its center. He wasn't toying with her. He'd been trying, clumsily, to help. She pressed her fingers to her temples and allowed herself one quiet, frustrated breath. Then she reached for her pen. Frederick found her in the garden behind her townhouse, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She was pruning roses with focused precision, her hands bare and stained with soil. She looked up at his approach but didn't rise. Your Grace, I received your note. You said to come. I did. She cut another stem, clean and decisive. I wanted to apologize for my assumptions at the auction. You were trying to help, however misguidedly. I was arrogant. Frederick crouched beside her, ignoring the damage to his coat. I saw a problem and applied my usual solution, money and authority. I didn't consider what that would cost you. Louise sat back on her heels, studying him with dirt on her hands and something softer in her eyes. Why do you keep coming here? Because you see me plainly. The truth came easier without ballroom strategies between them. Everyone else sees the Duke. You see the man making mistakes. She was quiet for a long moment, then held out a pair of pruning shears. Help me finish these roses. And tell me honestly why a duke knows anything about crop rotation. Frederick took the shears and began to smile. The whispers began at Lady Pemberton's evening soirée and spread like fire through dry grass. Louise heard them third-hand from her housekeeper, who'd heard them from a footman, who'd overheard Lady Victoria's sharp observations. She trapped him, naturally. Used her estate troubles to prey on his sense of honor. How convenient that she needed land precisely when the Duke took interest. Mark my words, she planned this from the beginning. Provincial cunning dressed as virtue. Frederick called the next morning. Louise refused to see him. He sent notes. She returned them unopened. When he appeared at her door on the 4th day, she finally received him in her study, standing rigid behind her desk like it was a fortress wall. You need to stop coming here, she said before he could speak. Louise? They're saying I trapped you. That I manipulated your kindness. Her voice was steady but her hands trembled. Your reputation will suffer if you continue this association. I won't be responsible for that. My reputation? Frederick stared at her in disbelief. You're protecting me. Someone has to think clearly. Then think about this, I don't care what they say. The letter arrived at dawn. Louise? I am not asking you to save my reputation. I am asking you to let me stand beside you while we both ignore it. Come to Carlton House tonight. Not as my obligation or my charity case, but as the woman I choose. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them watch us walk in together and know that their opinions hold no power over either of us. I cannot command your presence. I can only ask honestly, will you stand with me? Louise read it twice, then dressed in her finest gown, still modest, still her own, and waited for his carriage. They entered Carlton House together as the room fell silent. Every eye turned toward them. Louise felt the weight of judgment, the sharpness of scandal, the collective intake of breath. Frederick offered his arm. She took it. They crossed the floor slowly, deliberately, meeting every curious gaze with steady composure. Lady Victoria's expression curdled. Lord Ashworth looked away first. They're staring, Louise murmured. Let them. Frederick's voice was quiet but certain. They'll tire of it eventually. We won't. By the time they reached the far side of the ballroom, 3 people had nodded in greeting. By midnight, 7 more had joined them. The wedding at Hollybank was small, intimate by ducal standards, though the chapel still overflowed with spring light and white roses. Louise wore cream silk and carried nothing but wildflowers from the estate gardens. Frederick, watching her walk toward him, felt the weight he'd carried for a decade finally lift from his shoulders. She met his eyes and smiled, not the practiced smile of a ballroom, but something real and unguarded. Ready, she whispered when she reached him. Entirely. 3 years later, Frederick found her in the South Field, consulting with their steward about irrigation. Her hair had escaped its pins. Her dress bore mud at the hem. She was holding a sheaf of papers and arguing passionately about crop rotation. She looked perfect. Any regrets? She asked that evening as they walked their land together, the house glowing golden in the distance. Frederick considered the question seriously. He'd traded ballroom performance for honest labor, aristocratic distance for partnership, carefully maintained reputation for truth. Not one, he said, taking her hand. I spent 10 years being pursued for what I represented. You're the only one who chose me for who I am. Louise smiled. And you're the reason I stopped running. If this tale has stirred your curiosity, a simple like or subscription is most appreciated. And if you wish, share in the comments where you are listening from. Thank you.